The woman sitting across from Oprah Winfrey carried herself with the gentle authority of someone who had spent 45 years guiding young minds through the complexities of learning and growth. At 71, Mrs. Rose Johnson still possessed the warm presence that had made her a beloved figure in 3 generations of students' lives. But there was something different about her today. A hesitancy in her movements, a careful deliberation in her speech, and behind her wire-rimmed glasses, eyes that occasionally flickered with confusion before refocusing with determined clarity. She wore a soft blue cardigan over a white blouse, the kind of timeless, professional attire that had been her uniform through decades of teaching 3rd grade at Lincoln Elementary School. Her silver hair was styled in the same neat bob she had maintained for 20 years, and her hands, though slightly trembling, still moved with the expressive gestures of someone accustomed to making complex ideas accessible to 8-year-old minds. But today, in the warm embrace of Harpo Studios, surrounded by the familiar burgundy and cream that had welcomed millions of stories over the decades, Rose was struggling with something far more challenging than explaining fractions to reluctant students. The manila folder beside her chair contained what she had told the producers were innovative teaching materials for their discussion about integrating technology into elementary education. In reality, the folder held memory aids, carefully written notes about her own life, photos labeled with names and dates, and a list of the students she was most afraid of forgetting. For the past 6 months, Rose had been fighting a battle that all her years of education and experience couldn't help her win. The early stages of Alzheimer's disease were slowly stealing the memories that had defined her identity as an educator. The familiar energy of the Oprah Winfrey Show buzzed around them, but Rose felt disconnected from the warmth, struggling to process the overwhelming sensory input of cameras, lights, and 300 audience members. She had always been comfortable speaking to groups, parent-teacher conferences, faculty meetings, school board presentations, but today she felt disoriented by the complexity of the studio environment and the pressure of maintaining her composure, while her mind occasionally betrayed her with moments of blankness. Oprah Winfrey sat in her signature chair, radiant in a deep burgundy silk blouse that commanded both attention and respect. Her presence filled the studio with that unique combination of authority and nurturing wisdom that had made her the most trusted voice in American media for over 2 decades. Today's show was dedicated to educational pioneers, a special episode highlighting educators who had innovated in their classrooms and adapted to changing technologies while maintaining the timeless art of inspiring young learners. But Rose Johnson carried a secret that went deeper than educational innovation. She had gotten on the show under circumstances that felt increasingly dishonest. When the producers called for stories about teachers embracing new technologies and teaching methods, Rose had submitted a letter claiming she had developed innovative ways to integrate digital tools into traditional elementary education. It wasn't entirely untrue. She had tried to adapt to new teaching technologies in her final years before retirement. But the truth was that she had retired earlier than planned, not because she was ready to leave the classroom she loved, but because she could no longer trust her mind to serve her students with the excellence they deserved. Rose had begun teaching in 1978, fresh out of college with a degree in elementary education and boundless enthusiasm for shaping young minds. She had been assigned to Lincoln Elementary School in a working-class neighborhood, where many children came from families struggling with poverty, divorce, and the complex challenges of making ends meet while raising children who deserved a fair opportunity to succeed. From her first day in the classroom, Rose had discovered that teaching was more than just academics. It was about creating a safe space where children could take intellectual risks, where struggling readers could find confidence, where shy students could discover their voices. She had an intuitive understanding of how to reach different learning styles, how to make each child feel seen and valued, how to balance structure with creativity in ways that helped 8-year-olds thrive. Over 4.5 decades, Rose had taught approximately 1,200 children. She remembered not just their names, but their personalities, their struggles, their breakthrough moments. and their unique gifts. She remembered Tommy Martinez, who couldn't sit still until she discovered he learned best when he could move around the classroom. She remembered quiet Sarah Chen, who spoke English as a second language, but expressed herself beautifully through art until she found her verbal confidence. She remembered Michael Washington, who came to school hungry every day until Rose started keeping granola bars in her desk and quietly ensuring he had snacks. Rose had been the kind of teacher who arrived early and stayed late, who spent her own money on classroom supplies, who attended students' sporting events and school plays long after they had moved on to other grades. She had created innovative learning games before educational technology existed, had developed reading programs that helped struggling students catch up with their peers, and had maintained relationships with former students who returned years later to thank her for believing in them when they couldn't believe in themselves. But 3 years ago, Rose had begun noticing small changes in her teaching that concerned her. She would occasionally forget a student's name mid-sentence, something that had never happened in 42 years of teaching. She would lose track of where she was in lesson plans she had taught hundreds of times. She would find herself staring at familiar classroom materials, momentarily unable to remember their purpose or how to use them effectively. Initially, Rose attributed these lapses to normal aging, to the fatigue that comes with decades of demanding work, to the stress of adapting to new administrative requirements and technological expectations. But as the incidents became more frequent and more concerning, she began to worry that something more serious was happening to her mind. The breaking point came during a parent-teacher conference with the mother of one of her favorite students, 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez. Rose had taught Emma's older brother 5 years earlier, and had been delighted to welcome another member of the Rodriguez family into her classroom. But during the conference, Rose found herself unable to remember specific examples of Emma's progress. Despite having taught the child for 6 months, she struggled to recall recent assignments, couldn't find the work samples she had carefully organized, and realized with growing horror that she was failing to give Emma's mother the detailed, personalized feedback that parents deserved and that Rose had provided effortlessly for decades. That night, Rose made the decision that broke her heart but honored her commitment to her students. She would seek medical evaluation, and if her suspicions were confirmed, she would retire rather than risk providing substandard education to children who deserved her very best. The diagnosis came 6 months later: early-stage Alzheimer's disease. The neurologist had been gentle but clear. Rose could expect progressive memory loss, confusion, and eventual inability to perform complex cognitive tasks. There were medications that might slow the progression, strategies that could help her maintain function longer, but there was no cure, no way to stop the inevitable erosion of the mind that had been her greatest professional tool. Rose had finished the school year with careful planning and additional support from colleagues who didn't know the full extent of her struggles. She had said goodbye to her classroom, her students, and her life's work without revealing the true reason for her retirement. The official story was that she wanted to travel and spend time with family, a narrative that protected her privacy and avoided the complicated emotions that would inevitably arise if people knew their beloved teacher was losing the very cognitive abilities that had made her so effective. That's what had brought her to Oprah's show today. The letter she had written to the producers had been an attempt to maintain the illusion that she was still the sharp, innovative educator she had always been. She had hoped that by talking about teaching in general terms, by focusing on timeless principles rather than specific details, she could continue to contribute to educational conversations without revealing her cognitive decline. The show's opening segments had featured inspiring educators: a high school physics teacher who had revolutionized STEM education for underserved students, a kindergarten teacher who had developed innovative social-emotional learning programs, and a retired principal who had transformed a failing school into a model of academic excellence. Each story was uplifting, each guest embodying the dedication and innovation that made for compelling television. But when Oprah introduced Rose, something in her expression suggested she sensed this conversation might be different. "Ladies and gentlemen," Oprah announced, I want you to meet Mrs. Rose Johnson. For 45 years, Rose taught third grade at Lincoln Elementary School, where she became known for her innovative teaching methods and her ability to reach every child in her classroom. Today, she's here to share her insights about integrating technology with traditional teaching wisdom. Rose stood carefully, her movement betraying none of the anxiety that was making her heart race. As she walked to the interview area, she felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes on her, and worried that they might notice the slight confusion she felt about the studio layout, the way the lights seemed overwhelmingly bright, the challenge of processing so much visual and auditory information simultaneously. As they settled into their chairs, Oprah noticed the manila folder Rose clutched like a lifeline, and the way her eyes occasionally lost focus before sharpening again with visible effort. Rose, Oprah began warmly, 45 years in the same classroom. That's an incredible commitment to education. Tell us what kept you passionate about teaching for so long. Rose had rehearsed answers to questions like this, but sitting across from Oprah Winfrey, under the bright studio lights that somehow made everything feel both more real and more disorienting, she found herself struggling to access the smooth, professional responses she had planned. Well, Oprah, she began, her voice carrying the gentle authority that had guided thousands of young learners. I think the thing about teaching third grade is that you get to witness the moment when children really discover they can learn. 8-year-olds are old enough to tackle complex ideas but young enough to still believe in magic. She paused, her hands moving in the familiar gestures of someone accustomed to making abstract concepts concrete for young minds. Every day I would watch children who thought they couldn't read suddenly decode a difficult word, or see a student who struggled with math finally understand multiplication. Those breakthrough moments, they never got old. They never stopped feeling like miracles. The audience murmured appreciatively, recognizing the passion that had sustained a 4-decade career in education. But Rose, Oprah pressed gently, how did you adapt your teaching style as education changed around you? How did you integrate new technologies while maintaining that personal connection with students? Rose's carefully maintained composure flickered slightly. The question required her to access specific memories of recent innovations, to recall detailed examples of technological integration, to demonstrate the kind of sharp pedagogical thinking that had once been second nature but now felt increasingly elusive. The technology part has been, she started, then stopped, her hand moving to the manila folder, as if it contained the answers she couldn't quite grasp. It's been challenging to balance the new tools with the fundamental relationships that make teaching work. Oprah sensed the struggle and shifted her approach. Tell me about those fundamental relationships. What made your classroom special? Rose's face brightened as the question moved her toward more emotional, less detail-specific territory. The relationships were everything, she said, her voice growing stronger. I knew every child's story who needed extra encouragement, who learned better with hands-on activities, who was dealing with challenges at home. I knew that Marcus needed to move around while he learned, and that quiet Lisa expressed herself best through drawing before she found her verbal confidence. She paused, a shadow crossing her face. I knew that Michael came to school hungry, so I kept snacks in my desk. I knew that Sarah was learning English as a second language and needed extra patience with verbal instructions. I knew that her voice trailed off, and Oprah could see her struggling to access more specific memories. Rose, Oprah said gently, you're talking about these students like you remember each one individually. I do, Rose said immediately. Then her expression grew uncertain. I did. I remember so many of them. The subtle shift from present to past tense wasn't lost on Oprah, who had spent decades listening for the telling details that revealed deeper truths. Tell me about your most recent students, Oprah encouraged. The children you taught in your final years. Rose opened the manila folder with trembling hands, pulling out a photograph of her last third-grade class, 22 8-year-olds, arranged in 3 rows, all smiling at the camera. This is my last class, she said, holding the photo carefully. They were, they were wonderful children, so eager to learn, so full of potential. She stared at the photograph for a long moment, and Oprah could see her struggling. This little girl in the front row, Rose continued, pointing to a child with dark braids, she was very special. She loved to read. And Rose's voice faded as she realized she couldn't remember the child's name or specific details about her personality and achievements. Rose, Oprah said very gently, "What's her name?" The silence that followed was profound. Rose stared at the photograph, at the face of a child she had taught for an entire school year, and couldn't access the name that should have been immediately available to her memory. She whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't. I should know her name. I taught her for 9 months. I know I helped her with reading. I know she loved stories about animals, but I can't." The audience could see her distress, could witness the moment when someone who had spent her life helping others learn was confronting her own cognitive decline. "Rose," Oprah said softly, "what's happening?" Rose set the photograph down with shaking hands and looked directly at Oprah. Her eyes filled with tears and the kind of honesty that comes when pretense becomes impossible. "I'm losing them," she whispered. "I'm losing the memories of all the children I taught, all the names and faces and stories that made my career meaningful. I have Alzheimer's disease, Oprah. Early stages, but it's taking away everything that made me who I was as a teacher." The studio fell completely silent. 300 people holding their breath as they witnessed something unexpected and heartbreaking. A beloved elegiator confronting the loss of the very memories that had defined her professional identity. "How long have you known?" Oprah asked gently. 6 months, Rose replied. "I started noticing problems about 3 years ago. Forgetting names, losing track of lesson plans, struggling to remember which children needed extra help with specific skills. At first I thought it was just normal aging, but it kept getting worse." She picked up the photograph again, staring at faces she could see but couldn't name. "The hardest part isn't losing the memories. It's knowing I'm going to lose them. Every day, I try to hold on to the names and faces and stories, but they slip away a little more. Soon, I won't remember any of the children who trusted me to help them learn." Oprah leaned forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who understood the relationship between identity and memory. "Rose, do you think the love you gave those children disappears when you can't remember their names?" Rose looked at her with surprise, as if the question had never occurred to her. I don't know. If I can't remember them, how can I honor what we shared? How can their impact on my life have meaning if I can't access the memories?" "Maybe," Oprah said gently, "the impact wasn't just in your memory of them. Maybe it's in who they became because of you." That's when something unexpected happened. From the audience, a voice called out, "Mrs. Johnson." Everyone turned to see a young woman standing in the 8th row, tears streaming down her face. "Mrs. Johnson, it's Emma Rodriguez. You taught me in 3rd grade 15 years ago." Rose squinted at the young woman, trying to place her face among the thousands of students she had taught. "Emma," she said slowly, "I'm sorry. I can't quite—" "You probably don't remember me specifically," Emma said, walking down the aisle toward the stage. "But I remember you. You changed my life." Behind Emma, other audience members began standing, men and women in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, all raising their hands and calling out, "Mrs. Johnson taught me too." One by one, former students made their way toward the stage, each one eager to share how Rose had impacted their lives. Marcus Williams, now 28 and a successful engineer, was the first to reach the stage. "Mrs. Johnson, you probably don't remember me, but I was the kid who couldn't sit still. You let me stand at my desk and pace around the classroom while I learned. You told my parents that movement helped my brain work better. Because of you, I learned I wasn't broken. I just learned differently." Sarah Chen, now 35 and a published author, followed. "Mrs. Johnson, I came to your class, speaking very little English. You were patient with me. You let me draw pictures to show what I understood, And you never made me feel stupid for not knowing words. You taught me that intelligence comes in many forms. Michael Washington, now 31, and a teacher himself, stepped forward with tears in his eyes. Mrs. Johnson, you kept granola bars in your desk for me when I came to school hungry. You never made me feel ashamed about needing them. You just quietly made sure I had what I needed to learn. Because of your kindness, I became a teacher too. And I keep snacks in my desk for my students. One by one, former students shared specific memories of how Rose had seen their individual needs, had adapted her teaching to help them succeed, had believed in them when they couldn't believe in themselves. Rose sat in stunned silence, listening to story after story of impact she couldn't remember making but had clearly achieved. I taught all of you? She asked wonderingly. You did more than teach us, Emma Rodriguez said, speaking for the group that had now surrounded Rose on the stage. You saw us. You understood what each of us needed to succeed, and you gave it to us without making us feel different or broken or less than. Oprah was openly crying now, understanding that she was witnessing something profound. The demonstration that love and impact transcend memory, that the work of the heart continues even when the mind can no longer access its own achievements. Rose, Oprah said, do you see what these people are telling you? They're saying that even if you can't remember them, what you gave them is permanent. It lives in who they became. Rose looked around at the faces of former students, adults who had built successful lives, who had families and careers and purposes, who had been shaped by a teacher who could no longer remember shaping them. But if I can't remember you, she said to the group surrounding her, how can I take credit for who you became? Marcus Williams knelt beside her chair and took her hand. Mrs. Johnson, you don't need to remember us for us to remember you. The love you gave us, the confidence you built in us, the way you saw our potential, that doesn't disappear when your memory fades. It lives in us forever. Sarah Chen nodded in agreement. We are your living legacy. Every time I write a book, every time I help my own children believe in themselves, every time I remember that language is just one way to express intelligence, that's you continuing to teach through me. Michael Washington added, every time I see a struggling student and find a way to help them feel valued and capable, that's you teaching through me. Your impact multiplies every day whether you remember it or not. Oprah turned to address the cameras directly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed something sacred. Ladies and gentlemen, what we're seeing here is the true measure of a teacher's impact. It's not in test scores or evaluations, or even in memory. It's in the lives that were changed, the confidence that was built, the love that was given and received. She turned back to Rose, who was now surrounded by former students, each one eager to share how her teaching had shaped their lives. Rose, do you understand what they're telling you? They're saying that your work as a teacher was never about your ability to remember. It was about your ability to love, to see, to nurture, to believe in potential. And that gift lives on in every person you touched. Rose looked around at the faces surrounding her. Adults who had been children in her classroom, who carried pieces of her teaching with them every day, who were proof that impact transcends memory. I don't need to remember you for what I gave you to matter, she asked. No, Emma Rodriguez said firmly. You just need to know that it happened, that it mattered, and that it continues to matter every day of our lives. As the show concluded, Rose Johnson found herself embraced by dozens of former students, each one eager to remind her of the teacher she had been and the impact she had made. The woman who had feared that Alzheimer's would erase her legacy discovered that legacy isn't held in memory. It's written in the lives of those who were loved, taught, and believed in. In the months that followed, Rose's former students organized regular visits, creating new memories while helping her understand the permanence of her impact. They started a scholarship fund in her name for students pursuing education degrees. They wrote letters detailing specific ways her teaching had influenced their lives. They proved that the love between teacher and student transcends the ability to remember names or faces. The interview became a touchstone for families dealing with Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia, a reminder that identity and impact aren't solely dependent on memory. It showed that the love we give, the lessons we teach, and the confidence we build in others create ripple effects that continue long after our minds can no longer access the original moments of connection. Rose learned that being a teacher wasn't about perfectly remembering every student. It was about loving imperfectly, but completely about seeing potential in young minds. About believing that every child deserves to feel valued and capable. Those gifts didn't disappear when memory faded. They lived on in every life she had touched, in every student who remembered feeling seen and valued in her classroom. The teacher's silent classroom wasn't really silent at all. It was filled with voices of former students who carried her lessons with them every day, who had become teachers and parents and leaders because someone had believed in them when they were 8 years old and learning to read. Because the greatest teachers, Rose discovered, aren't remembered for their perfect recall. They're remembered for their perfect love, and love, unlike memory, never fades.